Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other this morning on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are here with us this morning. Welcome everyone to the October Scholar Talk. Here we are again with one of the library's fabulous fellows talking about their research with our rich collections over the last couple of years. This morning I get to introduce and host Dr. Rebecca Jones. She'll be actually known to many of you. She's a very well regarded historian of the environment, of climate and of rural health and well-being. She is, of course, the library's 2020 C.H. Curry Fellow, and she'll be talking about her research as a fellow this morning. As always, if you have any questions of Rebecca, please use the chat feature in Zoom, and we'll come back to that after her presentation, which is all about living with extremes in arid Australia. Thanks so much, Rebecca.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks very much for that introduction. And I'd also like to thank the State Library of New South Wales for hosting this fellowship and the C.H. Curry Fellowship for funding it. And I'm just disappointed that given it was a 2020 fellowship, I didn't get to, use it to the full degree, but it's been a fantastic opportunity. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Bunurong people in the area where I'm living and working now, to the Gadigal people of the land where the State Library of New South Wales sits, and to the 31 groups of Indigenous people whose lands lie in the area about which I'm speaking today. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Sister Myra Blanche here on the right. She's wading through the flooded Cooper Creek with Dr. Alan Woods from the Flying Doctor Service in 1945. This photograph must have been taken shortly after Myra started working for the Flying Doctor Service as a flying nurse. She was appointed and based in Broken Hill. She must have been about 34 here, freshly discharged from the army, nursing in Bougainville and Solomon Islands. Only a small number of publicly available photographs remain of this influential woman, but this is one of my favourite. Trousers rolled up to the knees, shirt above the elbows, fly net over a pith helmet style hat, striding through flowing water, mud and vast scrub. This is a woman with purpose, undaunted by her environment. At a time when gender roles were prescribed and circumscribed, Sister Blanche was adventurous and bold. She remained with the Flying Doctor Service for 10 years, and while she sometimes accompanied doctors on emergency flights, most of her work was solitary. She filled in for the doctor while on leave and attended patients in their homes. She negotiated drifting sand dunes, rough gibber plains, floodwaters, almost undiscernible tracks and mechanical breakdowns. Mostly alone in her car, Bubbles, or by plane, although she said she didn't enjoy flying. Her region was massive, 650,000 square kilometres, encompassing most of far west New South Wales, northeast and South Australia, and southwest Queensland Channel Country. Sister Blanche was always seen in a sensible white shirt and khaki trousers, leaving her nurse's veil and starched uniform for official occasions only. She was practical, competent, and had considerable initiative. Although men predominated in the inland Australia in the 1940s and 50s, her professional skills and demeanour inspired confidence and authority. Her adventurousness predated her army appointments, as she had worked as an Australian Inland Mission nurse in Inaminka in far north South Australia in the early 1940s. reason, having problems moving my screen on. I'll just stop sharing for a sec and okay. Now, Sister Blanche, now you know her better, we'll call her Myra. She grew up in rural southeast Queensland and obtained her general nursing and midwifery qualifications at the Epworth Hospital in Melbourne. While working for the Flying Doctor Service, she perceived a need for better health education for her patients and studied mother and infant health in Sydney before undertaking preventative public health studies in England. Convinced of the importance of preventing as well as curing ill health through improved living conditions, much of Myra's time was taken educating women living in remote pastoral stations about hygiene, sanitation and childcare. This is a more formal photograph of Myra. Myra's work was greatly influenced by a general renewal of interest in domestic and public health in the post-war period. There was a growing understanding of what we today describe as the social determinants of health, the social, cultural, political, physical and environmental, and access to healthcare issues as well as resources. And with this came an appreciation of the importance of diet, housing, living conditions, water quality and waste disposal. The trend was a continuation, or rather resurgence, of the hygiene and sanitation movement of the late 19th and early 20th century. Myra strongly advocated for the Flying Doctor Service to fully embrace in-home public health education to complement their focus on emergency medicine. As part of her public health work, Myra initiated a survey of living conditions for every household and community she visited. She documented housing, water supply, toilets, gardens, environmental conditions, distance from neighbours, supply lines, and access to radio communications and medical supplies, building on her experience of these places over 10 years. In the 1990s, not long before Myra died, she donated her papers to the State Library of New South Wales. Included in this bundle of papers was Myra's descriptive monthly reports and the original 268 survey data sheets, like this. These documents recorded living conditions for owners, managers, workers on 249 pastoral stations. 187 of these were in New South Wales, 42 in South Australia and 20 in Queensland. The data sheets also included 2 mission stations, which were run by the United Aborigines Mission, one at Finnis Springs near Maree in South Australia, and the other at Nepabunna in the Northern Flinders Ranges, also in South Australia. The data sheets also included a small mining community at Milparinka in New South Wales, a newly established Fowler's Gap Agricultural Research Station north of Broken Hill, an isolated hotel and police station at Nakundra in Queensland, and 5 itinerant workers' camps. Myra's work focused on people in the most remote areas. The Flying Doctor Service only operated beyond the realm of established health services. Therefore, larger towns such as Broken Hill, Wilcannia, Wannering, White Cliffs, Tibooburra, Menindee and Maree, which had their own hospitals, nursing centres or resident doctors, were not included in her network, nor in her survey. An unknown number of Indigenous people who lived in town camps on the fringes of Wilcannia and Maree who were ostensibly within the realm of the town's existing health services were also therefore excluded from the survey. Myra calculated her survey area had a permanent population of 2,480 people, 1,155 men, 545 women and 635 children under 13. This included 114 Aravana people who lived at Finner Springs, and 53 Andamartha people at Nepabunna. The survey also included 68 Indigenous men and women and their children living and working on and around pastoral stations, mostly in Queensland and South Australia, and one Indigenous tracker who was based at the Nakundra police station. The Gilby family, who owned Wonga Station near White Cliffs, were described by Myra as Aboriginal Afghan. The Glengyle Station datasheet provides a tantalising hint of an isolated Indigenous community of 7 elderly people living in a remote part of the station on the northern fringes of Myra's region. However, Myra had no contact with these people and we know nothing more about them. Myra surveyed 5 itinerant workers' camps, and I'll talk about these later, but she estimated there were approximately 620 people who were seasonal, casual, or itinerant workers, such as tank sinkers, fencers, bore drillers, drovers, and casual station hands. However, most of these people had only irregular contact with the Flying Doctor Service and therefore were also underrepresented in Myra's survey. So why should I, and you, care about this survey? Toilets, building materials, water supply, gardens. This research is part of a project exploring the physical and emotional effects of extreme weather in remote arid Australia in the first half of the 20th century through the records of the Australian Inland Mission and its offshoot, the Flying Doctor Service. As this COVID pandemic has illustrated to all of us, health and ill health involve a complex mix of vectors, individuals' biological and psychological and physiological characteristics, their behaviour, social and economic conditions, political and organisational structures, cultures, and physical environments. While I can't unpack all of these issues in the talk today, exploring the everyday living conditions of people who regularly experienced extreme weather can help us to understand the effects of climate and the ways people adapted or didn't adapt to these conditions. Myra's survey provides an extraordinary window into the way people lived their daily lives in arid areas in the 1940s and early 1950s. The environmental conditions and domestic challenges they faced each day in one of the harshest and most remote places in Australia. The lives of people in this region were inextricably entwined with climate. Winters were bright and warm with cold nights, but October to March were gaspingly hot. Unrelenting sun and heat conspired to create heat waves with temperatures over 40 degrees for many consecutive days. Rain was erratic at all times of the year. Long dry periods were occasionally punctuated by downpours from remnants of northerly monsoon or troughs or southerly cold fronts. And in dry weather, dust storms rampaged across the plains. This landscape was defined by heat and the absence of water. The rivers of the region, the Peru, the Diamantina and the Cooper, were ephemeral, with surface water confined to a few permanent waterholes along their course. Red sand and rock dominated, covered by a thin layer of vegetation through which protruded the rocky spine of the Flinders Ranges. You can just see that in the bottom left corner. The sandhills of the Strzelecki and Simpson Desert and the Stony Gibber Plains. These slowly subsided to the massive salty depression of Lake Eyre in the western side of the area. The Great Artesian Basin lay below the northern 2/3 of the region. While some artesian aquifers supplied fresh water, many were brackish and some too eye-wateringly salty for domestic use. A challenging climate meant this area was seriously remote and distances between communities were huge. In Western New South Wales and the Flinders Ranges, there was on average one person for every 67 square kilometres, but population was even more sparse in the remaining part of the region with one person every 350 square kilometres. Before I talk more about the survey and what it reveals about adaptation to extreme weather, I want to briefly discuss the social context in which Myra's work was undertaken. The maternal and infant welfare movement, of which Myra's work was a part, began in the interwar years, but flourished within a post-war conservative enthusiasm for prescribed family and gender roles. The family norm consisted of a male breadwinner with a female homemaker and child raiser. Women's exclusive engagement with and responsibility for the home was explicitly linked by the Menzies government to good citizenship, and the post-war preoccupation with population growth made this even more urgent. The maternal and infant health movement was driven by a conviction that women needed informing, improving and scrutinising, an agenda which did not always have women's own needs at heart. Women who deviated from the white middle-class norms were often viewed with suspicion and disapproval. Myra was certainly impatient with those she believed were not very capable or not progressive, to use her words, in health, or who were unwilling to conform to her ideas of appropriate domestic hygiene. But while emphasising these political agendas, it's also important to note that the public health and infant and maternal child health movements, attention to women and children was not cynical. Women were largely overlooked minority in the remote inland, but Myra's work prioritised their needs in the Flying Doctor Service and her survey, and noted issues that may otherwise have been ignored. For example, Myra was alert to the extra work which poor house design and lack of amenities created for women, and commented that a house was, to quote, not conveniently set out for women, big old-fashioned kitchen with heavy kettles and no hot water. Of course, implicit in this comment was the belief that women were less able to endure poor living conditions than men. But it's also important to remember that while the public health and maternal and child health movements were underpinned by certain cultural assumptions, women, children and men experienced very real health problems as a result of extreme weather. Living conditions played an important role in this, enhancing or ameliorating the effects of heat, dust, water shortage and flood. I'll explore 5 elements of Myra's survey, which give us particular insight into people's daily lives and the way they adapted or didn't adapt to their climate. These 5 points are the siting of the house, building materials, house design, water supply and toilets. I'll start with the siting of the house. The oldest homestead on pastoral runs occupied in the 19th century were located in the best areas, hugging the few permanent waterholes of the Darling, Cooper, Peru and Diamantina. These waterholes supported clusters of trees which gave shade from sun and shelter from hot winds and sand. For example, Kairanera homestead, which is northwest of Wilcannia, was an old stone homestead attractively set in a clump of gum trees beside a waterhole which supported a garden. By contrast, stations established later were relegated to barren, sandy locations with shade and shelter, without shade and shelter, subject to the full force of the wind and sand drift, which reflected and radiated heat from the ground. Orientos homestead on the Gibber Plains of east of Inaminka was described by Myra as the nearest approach to hell that I've experienced for a long time. Extremely hot. The homestead is set down in the midst of sand and gibbers with no shade or shelter. Only trees were a few stunted mulgars. The hot winds blew with varying degrees of force all day, picking up the sand and grit and hurling it around. Everything one touched was scorchingly hot. Seeking shade and shelter from a scattering of box trees along the watercourses, the Hannigans of Sandpar Station, north of Broken Hill, built their homestead in the dry Packsaddle Creek. The creek remained dry for 50 years until floods in 1949 drowned the homestead to its eaves. 15 other homesteads in the region were also completely inundated in these floods. After the floods subsided, the Hannigans chose to forego their sheltered position for a new site on higher ground, but this new homestead site had little shelter from sand and hot winds. Myra's survey also clearly shows the way building materials enhanced and ameliorated the effects of weather, particularly heat. In remote areas, all but the wealthiest residents had to rely on materials that were either locally available or could be easily and cheaply transported. The oldest surviving station buildings were made of local pisé or rammed earth or stone, which provided quite good heat insulation and were relatively cool and comfortable in summer. However, by the 1940s, corrugated iron was the most ubiquitous building material in remote areas, used for roofs, walls, yard fences, just about anything. Imported to Australia in the mid-19th century, then manufactured locally from 1915, corrugated iron, actually steel, was easily transportable, termite resistant, and the material of choice for cheap construction. For example, Omricon Station in far southwest corner of Queensland consisted of one large unlined iron shed divided between kitchen and sleeping areas, a lean-to bathroom and office at each end, and a cement floor. Occupants stewed in their own juices. Pastoral magnate Sidney Kidman was notorious for favouring corrugated iron as cheap construction material. The manager's residence at Quinamby Station near Lake Frome, Kidman Station, in South Australia, was erected in 1945, entirely of corrugated and angled iron, with a 6-foot circular corrugated iron fence to prevent sand drift. So notorious was Kidman for reliance on cheap building materials that Myra's shorthand description was, "The whole place was Kidman in aspect." Heat was a very real threat for people living in Myra's region. In December 1945, after 9 days of temperatures over 41 degrees, nurses at Tibooburra Hospital were busy with patients suffering heat exhaustion. A 19-year-old girl from a station west of Tibooburra collapsed. The owner and manager of Arid Station in Queensland were also evacuated to Adelaide. The cook at Milparinka Hotel, working over a wood stove in an uninsulated room, was overcome. And on the 8th of December, an 8-week-old baby of a boundary rider died from heat and dehydration as the flying doctor was grounded by dust storms. Cane grass was a building material much better suited to hot climates than corrugated iron. Reeds, straw or twigs were common roofing material throughout the early colonies, but swamp cane grass, which grew to 3 metres tall on watergrasses and clay pans of the Cooper and Diamantina, remained a popular building material in the Channel Country well into the mid-20th century. It was readily available locally, easy to use, and provided an efficient insulation for heat. Unfortunately, this church at Thargomindah in Queensland was eaten by hungry goats during the drought. Thatched meat safes were common on many stations throughout the Channel Country and Western New South Wales. Clifton Hill Station on the Birdsfield track also had a separate shelter made of grass and boughs where eating, relaxing and sleeping occurred during warmer months. An earlier homestead on the property had been constructed entirely of cane grass. Homes in Myra's region developed interesting design adaptations to the unrelenting heat. Most houses built before the Second World War in the region had detached kitchens and dining areas, partly to reduce the likelihood of fire in the main station house, but more immediately to reduce heat from cooking. And you can see here the external dining and cooking area at Napamerri Station in Queensland near the South Australian border. Many innovative methods were also used to increase air circulation in the home. And sorry, this photo is slightly blurred, but this is a photo of Olive Downs Station. And some stations such as Olive Downs, Fort Grey, Mount Sturt in far northwest New South Wales were constructed as separate buildings linked by a covered lobby or breezeway. You can see that breezeway sort of behind the car. Klondike Homestead, northeast of Whitecliffs, was built on 5-foot piles to increase airflow. And Marapina Station, north of Broken Hill, constructed a raised sleeping platform to catch the evening breezes. Manu Station on the Birdsville track chose another route to coolness by digging the house into the ground, as we see today in Coober and Lightning Ridge. Verandas on the north and west side of the house provided shelter from the sun and were almost universal in the region. If suitable water was available, creepers were grown along the veranda to create extra shade, as we can see here at Durham Downs Station. Or canvassed wall screens were soaked with water to create improvised evaporative cooling. The oldest homesteads in the region, such as Cadalgo outstation in northern South Australia, consisted of a row of small rooms, each opening directly onto a large veranda with no internal doors. Much of the daily living occurred in the shade of verandas, and nearly half of the stations Myra visited had sleep-outs on the veranda or detached from the main house. Unusually, Oriental Station, which we visited earlier, lacked a veranda in the 1950s and consequently was, as Myra declared, just a hot box. By the 1950s, 80% of homes had verandas or windows which were enclosed by fly screens in Myra's survey. This was an aspect of housing design to which Myra paid close attention, not only because of the preponderance of flies made life uncomfortable, but they also contributed to the spread of contagious eye infections. 50% of the people Myra surveyed in her region had eye infections, and 35% of the people she surveyed had very severe infections, including trachoma. Myra noted that at Nepabunna and Finnis Springs Mission, only the supervisors' houses were screened for flies, and fly infections were very common. The precariousness of water supply defined everyday life in this area. Although most houses had rainwater roof tanks to collect drinking water, these usually dried during summer, leaving residents to rely on other sources of drinking water for many months of the year. 60% of households relied on ground tanks or dams, while another 15% used natural water holes and billabongs. Only 40% of households Myra surveyed had access to bore water suitable for domestic purposes. Therefore, with 84% of stations relying on untreated surface water, there was much potential for contamination of water supplies. Heat and drought depleted water supplies, concentrated pollutants in remaining water sources, and limited access to clean water for washing and preparing food. You can see in this photograph I took in 2018, a green water hole with goats and kangaroos drinking and dead sheep around the edge. Many water holes and ground tanks were shared by humans, horses, cattle, sheep, and native animals, and this competition increased contamination by manure and sometimes dead animals caught in the mud. Floods increased chances of pollution as sewage, animal waste, and other pollutants on the soil surface flushed into water holes. Myra vividly describes the effect of polluted water, flies, and lack of refrigeration at the tiny Queensland town of Batuta race meeting in September 1953, where 200 people gathered. Myra says, "I was feeling psychologically ill myself from the very thought of open drains awash with polluted water, flies swarming into the kitchen and dining room. Meat had gone off in the hot sun, and some young hopefuls seen grilling some of this meat over coals where water was heated for baths. Oh well, it was a good race meeting. No one who attended these races escaped the town without vomiting and diarrhea." Access to clean water for washing helped to prevent contagious eye infections, and permanent fresh water allowed 17 of Myra's stations a luxury lawns, which cooled the air and reduced sand in and around the home. Others with access to permanent water holes, such as Kaironera and the Nepabunna Mission, were able to cultivate a garden of fruit and vegetables to supplement their diet. However, even after the long 1940s drought had broken, 25 stations, as well as the Finnis Springs Mission, had no access to domestic water of any quality and were carting water, some as far as 20 miles. This amounted to approximately 240 people. Another 39 houses had no piped water to the house, despite having access to a water supply. These figures, of course, don't include the unsurveyed temporary workers' camps or Indigenous town camps, which were also mostly without domestic water supply. The modern, hygienic 1950s home, with access to plentiful water and cooking facilities, was barely a dream for these people. Toilets greatly interested Myra, as they were potentially a source of flies and water pollution. 3/4 of the stations she surveyed had earth pit toilets, a hole topped with a timber board. These were easily constructed from readily available materials and didn't require water, so were very popular. But while convenient, earth pits were not sealed and attracted flies. Although more hygienic, fly-proof and less aromatic, septic tanks were more expensive and required transported equipment to construct, and only 20% of the stations that Myra surveyed had septic tank, all being station owners and managers' residences in areas easily accessible by rail. Unless septic tank and earth pits were very carefully sited, however, in soil that lay carefully between clay and gravel, they became pollution hazards if they leaked into watercourses or flooded during heavy rain. 3 households surveyed by Myra had no toilet facilities at all, and it's likely the other unsurveyed temporary workers camps and town camps were also without toilet facilities. One of the issues highlighted by Myra's survey was the great disparity in living conditions experienced in remote areas. As Myra commented, while some houses have all conveniences which can be obtained to alleviate the climatic conditions, there are still people living under camp conditions, and not all homes by any means have adequate protection against extreme summer heat. Poor living conditions were not spread evenly, and those with the least access to money, land, reliable transport and reliable employment had the least ability to adapt to climatic conditions. People with little control over their housing were particularly vulnerable, and many employees experienced substandard housing. Of the 31 households which Myra decided had the worst living conditions, 25 were employees. People who lived in outstations, remote from the already remote main homestead, usually lived in poor conditions with minimal comforts. Brinner Well, which was an outstation of Olive Downs, one of the largest and wealthiest, illustrates a divide between living conditions experienced by owners of large, comfortable, profitable stations and those of the poorest and most dislocated members of society. Myra described Brinner Well as her bugbear. The house was an old tin hut in bad need of repair, set in a sandy waste with a dirt floor, no veranda, no flywire and no windows. She writes, "I got bogged in sand and had my already flagging spirits further dampened. The home, or other camping place, remains indescribably dirty and untidy. Admittedly, it's not fit for anyone to have to live in. The place is a real blot on the landscape, and not a very attractive landscape at that. A tumble-down shack, no conveniences other than the well where stock also water." Myra continues, "I stayed long enough to get in a thoroughly bad mood and promised myself I would have a piece of the manager about that place." The manager of Olive Downs had condemned the building in 1946 and promised to rebuild it, but in 1953, little had changed. His response to Myra's complaints was, "Can't help people who won't help themselves." This reflects a prevailing view that living conditions were a sign of character rather than social inequality. Like earlier iterations of the hygiene and sanitation movement in the late 19th century, the post-war public health movement had an explicit political element of cleansing behaviour considered to be unhygienic from the lower classes. Myra also was judgmental of people who lived in conditions she considered unhygienic, although she was very aware of the role that employment played in housing conditions. Huts supplied by the Western Lands Commission for boundary riders are a good example of the conditions experienced by many employees. 13 boundary riders were employed by the Western Lands Commission to patrol the dingo exclusion fence along the border New South Wales shared with Queensland and South Australia. These riders and their families were a community for which Myra advocated throughout her appointment. Built to a similar plan, the huts had 2 rooms with a front veranda housing a kitchen at one end and a rudimentary afterthought of a bathroom at the other. I think this photograph was taken before the bathrooms and the kitchens were added. The buildings were constructed of uninsulated iron, so were hot in summer and cold in winter. A baby girl died of heat stroke in this Hungerford hut in the summer of 1945 to 1946, and a child evacuated with heat exhaustion from another Boundary Riders hut in 1953. On her first visit to the Boundary Rider community in 1946, Myra noted that many of the children had eye infections and some were badly nourished, as it was difficult to procure supplies to the furthest huts. Kitchens had no water, and fridges, if they were installed, were supplied by the Boundary Rider themselves from their meagre wages. Many of the huts were overcrowded. Smithville, on the New South Wales-South Australian border, housed a family of 14 in 1954. Myra contacted the overseer in 1946, and the Western Lands Commission made plans to install separate food stores and laundries, but by 1954, 3 of the riders remained without these additions still. Whitecatch, another Boundary Riders hut, sat on what Myra described as a Cinderella section of the fence, the poorest, most degraded environment along the fence. She wrote during drought in March 1946, bad living conditions, dust and flies predominated. Hut enclosed by fly wire, but as many flies in as out. The well gone dry, ground tank empty, there's no rain, water carted 25 miles. No water meant no garden and no growth of feed, so no goats. And goats went far afield and didn't return. Fowls refuse to lay, meat supply is uncertain, and all comes tinned or salted. Myra described the Boundary Rider's wife, Mrs. Kay, as cheerful and happy, but the children as pale and thin. She writes, Mother knew they were not getting enough fresh greens or dairy, though we can't make rain to fill the tanks. There was an outbreak of dysentery among the Boundary Riders' families in April 1951. People on the fringes of society, such as those with a regular seasonal and itinerant work and those without employment, many of whom were Indigenous, had the least control over their living conditions and lives. By the end of the Second World War, many Indigenous people had been displaced, deposed and dispossessed from this area. Those that remained had less control over their lives than most people, as the state government had power to control their movement and living places. Myra's brief description of living conditions at Finnis Springs was primitive, although Nepabunna, she wrote, by the early 1950s, had what she described as quite good accommodation built of stone, corrugated iron and cane grass. Shearers enjoyed better living conditions than most seasonal itinerant workers due to the collective influence of the Australian Workers' Union, which demanded reasonable standards of accommodation. However, most itinerant workers, such as drovers, tank and bore sinkers, fencers, transporters, and their families lived in temporary camps or tents or caravans, usually without fridges, fresh drinking water, or toilet facilities. For example, a family of seasonal workers on Olive Downs Station had 2 tents for sleeping, an iron hut for cooking. Myra commented, could be quite comfortable in a reasonable season, but I hate to think of it in a dry summer with heat waves and dust. The following photographs show conditions in which people with the least resources, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, lived in remote arid Australia in the mid-20th century. Myra left the Flying Doctor Service in 1955, and as and the organisation moved to focus on acute health rather than public health. The survey data languished in the services archives. While Myra's survey ultimately contributed little to the longer-term delivery of healthcare in remote Australia, it's left an extraordinary legacy for the historian. In the 10 years that Myra worked for the Flying Doctor Service between 1945 and 1954, she saw improvement in living conditions, which brought better health. This was particularly noticeable in the decline in eye problems. Living conditions in Myra's region had changed little through the 1930s and 40s. Then the long 1940s drought dangerously diminished water supplies. Dust was deplorable and discretionary income non-existent. These conditions, combined with a nationwide shortage of building materials during the Second World War, left housing conditions stagnating at best, declining at worst. After the drought ended, 1949 to 51 were exceptionally wet years. Much vegetation regrew and pastoralists' finances were boosted by the wool and beef export boom in the 1940s and 50s. Dilapidated houses were renovated or rebuilt, and for many, living conditions improved. Some stations installed wind or diesel-powered 32-volt electric light plants, which powered lighting fans and kitchen appliances. With more water available, gardens with fruit and vegetables were cultivated at some stations, and better availability of canned food after the war meant nutrition increased in remote areas. We tend to think of living conditions and insulation from weather extremes as continually improving over time, as we gain access to new technologies and greater disposable income. However, some of the new 1950s houses in Myra's area were poorly sited. New stations created in far western New South Wales after the Subdivision Acts of the 1940s were particularly poorly located. Many post-war houses were constructed of weatherboard, corrugated iron or cement blocks with poor insulation, as we saw at Omricon earlier in this talk. Some stations with larger electric light plants relied on electric-powered amenities rather than sound house design, shade and shelter, resulting in extremely hot houses, cheaply and rapidly constructed, but unsuitable for the climate conditions in which they were located. Today, most of us have ready access to washing machines, dishwashers, hand basins, daily showers, treated water at the turn of a tap, cooling devices for summer and heating for winter, municipal sewerage treatment and fresh food at the opening of a refrigerator. Extreme heat, droughts, floods, dust storms cause great discomfort and economic problems, but they're only rarely a direct threat to life. However, for people living in arid areas of Australia, only 70 years ago, extreme weather events were a way of life. The enmeshment of intense weather, remoteness and living conditions meant that for many people, living was tough. Little separated them from heat, dust, flood and water shortage, and the difference between comfortable, uncomfortable and seriously dangerous was slight. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. That was a terrific talk and so many great photographs of the outback that I had not seen before. So thank you very much for sharing all of that material with us. We do have a couple of questions coming in. Someone's suggesting that this might be slightly outside the scope of your talk today, but they're wondering how Myra reflected on the emotional and mental health impact on women as they struggle to fulfill cultural expectations that they maintain a comfortable home, as well as safeguard their family's health in such obviously difficult conditions. Are you able to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Myra did talk about the emotional experience of this, and emotional experience is certainly part of my broader project. I didn't really have enough time to touch on that much today. She has an ambivalent attitude to emotional issues. She designates people, both men and women, capable or not capable. And she has a very strong idea about the resilience and strength, hardiness, flexibility, adaptability that both men and women, but her particular concern with women, should show in the outback. And those that were unable to do that were tended to be categorised as not capable. And this, she was not alone. She was part of an ethos of the outback at the time, and an ethos of the Flying Doctors and Australian Mainland Mission, which mythologised people for being resilient and hardy and flexible and adaptable and all of those things.
And her war service would have played into that as well, no doubt.
The what service?
Her war service.
Oh yes, I'm sure. Yes, yeah. She was of that time, that group of professional, educated women who had, withstood a lot themselves and were a little impatient with those who weren't. But having said that, she was, as I said about the physicals, in the same way that I mentioned about the physical deprivations, she was very sympathetic to women who were through, employment conditions, housing conditions beyond their control, living in appalling conditions. And she did do, as she did for the boundary riders, she advocated for them and, tried to improve their conditions, either with the station manager or whoever. And she spent quite a lot of time talking about women's issues. She didn't really specify what they were. I mean, they could be physical things, to do with childbirth. They could be emotional issues. I'm not sure.
Was she, she'd obviously had some pretty tough experiences herself if she had done war service. Questions coming through at the moment about whether she was also quite shocked by the conditions and how she was able to cope in these really arid environments. Does she talk about her own response in a lot of detail?
She travelled in these areas. She lived in Broken Hill, attached to the hospital. She travelled in these areas and stayed with, if she wasn't flying, she stayed with station people. And she tended to stay with the better equipped people. I mean, I think there'd probably be two sides of that. One is that there would be no accommodation for her elsewhere, and also probably for her own comfort. She didn't really talk about the deprivations she experienced herself, except, just the sort of short-term ones like being bogged in sand and that kind of stuff. She was very uncomfortable with other people's deprivation, though, as I mentioned in the talk. Yeah.
Someone's asking a really interesting question about the housing and the housing materials, and they're asking if cane grass was so effective. Do you have any understanding of maybe why people stopped using it?
I don't really. I've seen photographs from the 1960s, which are a little bit beyond my period, but there's still cane grass used in the 1960s.
Okay.
I don't know of any now, but there could well be. So no, I don't. I suspect there was such a big push in the 1950s and 60s for modernity and modernisation and the sort of favouring of building materials such as corrugated iron and cement blocks, which were cheap,
Get really hot,
easy, but not necessarily, ideal for that climate. And I suspect that kind of push for modernity, which came with greater prosperity in the early 1950s, was part of the reason why those kind of old-fashioned, so-called old-fashioned building materials such as rammed earth and cane grass did fall out of favour.
You mentioned water several times this morning, and somebody is asking about mentions of salinity-related health issues from drinking water in Myra's survey, and if you could make any more comment on that.
The stations that had the majority of the bore water was slightly saline, and was it can be slightly saline bore water can be used for stock, but not for human. And so that, I think that's why only 14% of stations used bore water on their in their houses, because most of it was slightly saline. It was only the lucky ones that had fresh water. There was no mention of specific health issues to do with saline water. I think people were more likely to be drinking their preference, of course, was fresh tank water. But if that was not available, they were more likely to be drinking the surface water, which was not saline, than they were to be drinking saline bore water.
And somebody's asking if Myra kept statistics on loss of life during childbirth while she was doing this work.
It's not part of the survey. She didn't, her survey didn't look at those kind of acute health issues at all. It was a public health survey. She did, of course, treat those, and they're mentioned in her notes, which accompanied her files, her monthly report. But I don't have the medical records that went with it. I just have her, the written reports, which mention cases she's seen, but don't actually keep a statistical list of. I'm sure those medical records were kept, but they're not part of her collection, unfortunately.
It is an extraordinary collection. She kept quite a bit.
Fantastic. And I suspect I'm the first person to have looked at these data sheets because of the way they were laid in the archive boxes. I don't think another researcher has looked at them, so I felt very privileged to be seeing them.
It's an unusual thing to be able to say that, sort of go in there and do that work. This is going a little bit after your time frame, but there are a couple of people actually asking if other nurses after the 1950s helped with Myra's work or picked up where she left off.
Unfortunately, they didn't. Myra, in Myra's reports, she continually advocated for, she actually advocated for 2 nurses to be based at Flying Doctors bases, such as Broken Hill, where she was based. She wanted one who would do the acute work, go out with the doctors on emergency calls, that sort of thing, and one who could do this public health work. Unfortunately, when she left, no one was appointed to replace her in either of those roles. Much later, during the 1960s, not much later, but during the 1960s, some nurses were appointed in other bases, other Flying Doctor bases. But they were doing the acute, flying out with nurses and flying out with the Flying Doctors and doing the acute emergency health rather than the public health education. No, the Flying Doctors really moved away from that emphasis shortly after Myra left. And I don't know why Myra left. I mean, she'd been there 10 years. She may have wanted a change. But I do wonder if perhaps the Flying Doctors' unwillingness to embrace public health education may have been a reason why she left. I don't know. I'm just speculating that.
It's tough work.
It is tough work, and tough being located there, yeah. Yes.
And especially if she felt that she was having those conversations about living conditions, in 1946, and then having to have the same conversation again in 1953 or whenever it was. I can imagine that would that would be a tough gig. So
Yeah.
I think she did pretty well to do so much in the time that she spent with that service.
She went to, her family came from Nambour in Queensland, and she went to Queensland after she left the flying doctor service, and so that might have been a motivation as well.
And we have heaps and heaps of comments. I'm having trouble keeping up with them all. People really amazed to hear this story. They're so glad that you've found it and that you've been able to share it with us this morning. Some people are a little bit frustrated that we keep having the same conversations about climate and living conditions and what should we build our houses out of. But it's great that we are at least still having this conversation and doing what we can to keep it public and keep people thinking about these important issues that impact all of us. So unfortunately, these hours for our Scholar Talks go so quickly. We are out of time, but I would like to warmly thank Rebecca for sharing her research with us today. She did a phenomenal amount of work in a few sprints at the library because of our pandemic-related restrictions, but she's, of course, always welcome back. And you are also very welcome to come back next time. Do join us on the 2nd of November at 11 o'clock. It will be our last Scholar Talk for 2021. Dr. Benjamin Huff will be talking about his project as a Hertzberg Fellow. He has been researching colonial liquidity and how does an economy run when you actually don't have a lot of coins circulating. He's written a new history about banking and money and finance in colonial Sydney, and it's absolutely fascinating. So I hope you can join us next time for our final Scholar Talk of this season. Until then, don't forget there's lots happening for your library at home. Just come to the library's website and find something that you're interested in and book in. We have our Coral Thomas talk coming up. This only happens every 2 years. It will be 6 p.m. on the Thursday, the 14th of October. It's on our website under special events. So do be sure to come along to that and hear Sally Young talk about her amazing work that she's been doing as a Coral Thomas Fellow. Until then, stay safe, everyone, and see you soon.